Anime, the world of deadbeat dads, missing mothers, and twisted genealogy. When it comes down to it, trying to figure out a family tree in an anime is like trying to figure out a family tree in the southern states of the United States. Sometimes a tree looks more like a wreath, and sometimes a tree looks more like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree, missing a couple branches and weirdly smaller than you anticipated. In a genre where it's fairly common for a 12-year-old to live by themselves, parents are usually kind of an afterthought. And thus, when it comes to questions like who's your father, who's your mother, where are they, usually RMCs don't have much of an answer. And that's for the main characters of the story. When you get even one separation away from the most important character in the entire anime universe, the idea of being introduced to other characters' parents and knowing their names and what they do, or even if they exist, gets slimmer and slimmer the further you get away from the main character. And that kind of makes sense. We're not going to do a Meet the Family for every character in a massive universe. However, for some characters, Meet the Parents seems massively more important than for others. See, because, well, nobody needs to know who Tenten's parents are. Knowing who Toneri's parents are seems highly important, and trying to figure out the answer to that question is one of the most talked about things in the Naruto and Boruto fandoms. See, because while Toneri doesn't play as big a role in the Naruto story as Tenten, that's definitely not true. It's a bad comparison. Let's go with Sakura. We never meet her parents in canon. See, just because Toneri doesn't play as big a role as Sakura in the grand story of Naruto doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to know who Toneri's parents are more than we'd want to know who Sakura's parents are. Because Sakura's parents are just some people who run a flower shop. Well, the answer to who Toneri's parents are might reveal the literal ending of Boruto. And understanding Toneri's lineage could lead us to the answer of why he, as somebody who should be less Otsutsuki than Asura and Indra, his cousins, looks more Otsutsuki than either of them. And upon the answering of why he looks more Otsutsuki than the people he's less Otsutsuki than, hypothetically, we can not only figure out who Hamura married, but also where she came from. And most importantly, glean as to whether or not she was Shibai's missing pair Otsutsuki. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going back thousands of years into our Naruto history to try and crack the code once and for all of who were the two missing Otsutsukis depicted on the stone temple of Ishiki's Ten Tails hideout. And while this question has been attempted to be answered thousands of times, I genuinely believe the true answer lies with Toneri. And thus today we're talking Shibai's partner revealed. But before we get to revealing anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me revealing things about your favorite anime and manga, you're gonna love my other channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other anime. And if you like the idea of me just talking about anime, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Talk is Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you just want to look like somebody who keeps up with all things anime and manga, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, talkisanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. But before we get into all that, today we got to talk about a brand new sponsor to the page, Rhino Shield. Rhino Shield is a website that has all the best phone cases and accessories for your standard anime lover. See, Rhino Shield works in collaboration with some of the most popular Japanese projects in history. Be they Naruto, Hunter x Hunter, Attack on Titan. If it's got 15 to 18-year-old boys screaming in it, they got a phone case of it. But outside of looking incredible, Rhino Shield also prides itself on making incredibly durable phone cases that are just as sturdy as they are customizable for either Apple or Android phones. On top of all this, Rhino Shield is dedicated to making sure that their products lead to a more sustainable future. But how do they achieve that? Well, all of their cases are made out of a mono material. And since their cases are made out of one material, it makes them much easier to recycle. So let's say one day you're done looking at Aruka's face, well, you just throw this case in the recycling bin and it'll get melted down and used for something else down the line. And that's the beauty of a product made with a single polymer. But Rhino Shield does more than just dedicate themselves to making sure their cases are recyclable. They also try to source the materials for their products from reusable sources. In fact, Rhino Shield prides themselves on the fact that they use recycled fishing nets to make their Apple Watch wristbands. But more than this, all of Rhino Shield's products are made using non-toxic materials. So not only is it good for the earth, it's good for you. But on top of all that, Rhino Shield's cases also offer an 11-foot drop rating that they're able to achieve with their shock spread technology. And if you opt in to get both a Rhino Shield phone case and a Rhino Shield screen protector, you can have 360 degrees of protection. But the back isn't the only thing you can customize with the Rhino Shield case. You can customize the camera rings, the buttons, or even the color. I ordered this one in pink. So what are you guys waiting for? Use the link in my description to shop the Naruto Shippuden collection from Rhino Shield today. And who knows? we could match. So recently, my resident theory grabber, Emil, hit me up with a half-completed theory that piqued my interest. Now, none of you would know Emil, but Emil is responsible for a lot of our recent videos, as Emil is one of the few people who emails me cohesive and well-thought-out theories, or at least the beginnings of cohesive and well-thought-out theories that I then extrapolate on and build out into a video. And Emil has planted the seed in my brain for videos like Boruto's anime has been cancelled, Itachi is training Sarada, and Sakura is Kaguya's vessel. So usually when I get an email from Emil, I pay attention. However, Emil has been trying to get me to talk on one theory for a rather long time, and it's a good theory. But it took a lot of research, and more specifically, it took research into parts of Japanese folklore and history that I didn't know all that much about, which it's kind of rare. See, this theory that Emil's been trying to get me to talk about for a while tries to answer the several-year-old question of why does Toneri look like that? Because objectively, Toneri, who should be at most a quarter Otsutsuki, looks like a full-blooded Otsutsuki. He was born with Byakugan, he has white skin, white hair. Everything about Toneri makes him appear as though he's a full-blooded Otsutsuki. But Asura and Indra, who have the same percentage of Otsutsuki in them as Toneri should be if Toneri is a child of Hamura, look fully human. And while one could say that, well, being an Otsutsuki is probably like being any mix of races. There are children of two dark-skinned black parents who end up light-skinned. There are children of one white, one black parent who end up darker than their black parent. That's because things like the expression of melanin are kind of a crapshoot. And while obviously any child is more likely to look like their parents than not, that doesn't mean that not looking like your parents is not an impossibility. But the differences between Asura, Indra, and Toneri are not a matter of a couple of gene switch-ups. They are fully different races. And while you might be saying,
well, yeah, Nick, but it's alien DNA. You either look like an Otsutsuki or you don't. And therefore, it's a possibility that maybe Toneri just got the genetic roll of a dice to look like an Otsutsuki, but Asura and Indra didn't.
It's actually not how it works. And the last proves that, as you can very much look like a combination of Otsutsuki and human simultaneously. And thus, it's not one or the other. It is almost definitely a spectrum. But the fact that it exists as a spectrum makes the existence of Toneri all the more confusing. See, because it's widely assumed that Hamura, when he went to the moon, brought a human wife with him. Because so far as we knew, humans were really the only choice for Hamura and Tagoromo, as after they sealed Kaguya, they were the only people with any Otsutsuki DNA whatsoever existing on Earth. And both Hamura and Hagoromo got around, as Hamura not only had descendants on Earth who eventually became the Hyuga, meaning he had an Earth wife, but he also went up to the moon and propagated an entire clan, though it is widely assumed that he brought non-related people with him to the moon as well. In fact, it's all but confirmed that he brought non-related people to the moon with him as well. But since Toneri exists on the moon and Toneri is Toneri Otsutsuki, that means that Hamura had kids on the moon as well. And since everybody on the moon also had Byakugan, as they were sacrificing their Byakugan to the Tenseigan to power it, this means that at least the majority of people that ended up on the moon were from Hamura. But listen, Hamura wasn't the only womanizer out of the two brothers. Hagoromo had children that were Indra and Ashura, propagated the clans of the Uchiha, the Senju, and the Uzumaki, but also probably had kids in the Land of Lightning who eventually became Kinkaku and Ginkaku. Something about being half Otsutsuki made you real bangable about 2,000 years ago, which actually, when you consider ancient Japanese makeup rituals and how the women always did like crazy amounts of white makeup, kind of makes sense, I guess. But if Hamura had brought a human wife to the moon, then his children would be a quarter Otsutsuki, as Hamura himself is only 50% Otsutsuki, meaning that his children should have looked like Asura and Indra, and his grandchildren should have definitely looked like Asura and Indra. But here's the wildest thing. Toneri is almost definitely not Hamura's son, because while Toneri is obviously a descendant of Hamura, there is a fair to almost completely certain chance that Toneri is not Hamura's son, and is rather at least his grandson. As when Toneri in the last is telling Hinata all about the collapse of the Moon Clan, he's telling Hinata the linear history of how the Moon Clan came to be and how it came to collapse. And in this story, Toneri is telling Hinata about Hamura's death, and how on his deathbed he told all of his descendants who are grouped around him that if the ninja on Earth continued to abuse chakra, that they, as the Moon Clan, should wipe out humanity and start again. Now obviously, Hamura didn't say any of this, but when Hamura is on his deathbed and is surrounded by his descendants, Toneri is not in the room. A couple of scenes later, probably like a minute of movie time later, Toneri is talking about his clan and how they decided that it was time to destroy humanity for abusing chakra, the gift that Hagoromo gave them. And in this scene, we see Toneri standing with his faction. And in this scene, Toneri is a child. On top of this, Toneri is standing next to a person who we can only assume is Toneri's father, as the man in this scene standing next to a young Toneri has white skin and a long white beard. And thus, this seems to imply that Toneri is not only born after Hamura's death, but this mysterious middle link Otsutsuki is Toneri's father. And what else is super interesting about this scene is that in the grouping of people standing around Toneri, while Toneri and his father are the only people who look fully Otsutsuki, there is a spectrum of half Otsutsuki, half non-Otsutsuki looking people standing behind Toneri and his presumed father. And while none of the people in this grouping look full Otsutsuki, the people flanking Toneri and his presumed father to their left and right have white skin, or at least substantially whiter skin than the other people in the group. Thus, these characters are meant to symbolize the fact that the Otsutsuki is running out of their blood and they're beginning to look more and more like humans, but that these characters can exist as half human, half Otsutsuki looking people, with human colored hair but Otsutsuki colored skin. But some people would make the argument that this man standing next to Toneri is Hamura, thus proving that Hamura is Toneri's father. But Hamura, so far as we know, never grows a beard like his brother Hagoromo, and definitely not one as long, robust, and full as the man who's standing next to child Toneri. And it would make sense since Toneri is telling his story linearly that Hamura dies and then he's young, which would imply that Hamura wasn't exactly knocking boots with the women on the moon to make him. But that means if Hamura did marry a human woman and had a child with her on the moon who eventually became this bearded Otsutsuki looking man standing next to the child Toneri, that man should only be 25% Otsutsuki. And if Toneri is the child of that man, that means that Toneri should only be, at most, 12.5% Otsutsuki. You know, unless Hamura had multiple kids and those kids, we're not going to entertain that. So how does Toneri, somebody who is 12.5% Otsutsuki, look more like an Otsutsuki than Ashura and Indra, who are at least 25%? Well, because Toneri is more Otsutsuki than them. See, this theory states that Hamura didn't marry a human woman, but instead a missing Otsutsuki female, with whom he had children, who would eventually go on to have Toneri, which would make Toneri somewhere around 40% Otsutsuki, as Hamura's child with a full-blooded female Otsutsuki would be around 75% Otsutsuki. And assuming that their children would marry entirely out of their bloodline, that means that their children would be about half of 75, or close to somewhere around 38% Otsutsuki, meaning that technically in this circumstance, Toneri would have more DNA and chakra from Otsutsukis than either Asura or Indra, and might represent the bare minimum cutoff for the amount of Otsutsuki DNA in your body to look like an Otsutsuki. But the real question is, where'd this female Otsutsuki come from? We can't just assume she existed to conveniently help explain why Toneri looks the way he does. Well, as we all know, there's an unaccounted for set of Otsutsukis who have come to Earth, and we learned this from Ishiki's hideout, which had the sigils of all of the Otsutsuki who have come to Earth engraved in the side. However, one of the three pairs was destroyed and looked much older than all the other pairs. Now, it's conventionally accepted, now that we know everything that we do about the Otsutsuki, that these pairs were Kaguya and Ishiki, Momoshiki and Kinshiki, and Shibai and his pair, as we now at least kind of know that Shibai has been to Earth. And the reason that I say kind of is because Shibai's body is on Earth, as we know that Amado used parts of Shibai's body to give Ada and Daemon and the rest of the cyborgs their Shinjutsu. However, technically Amado using Shibai's body to give Shinjutsu to cyborgs that exist kind of on Earth doesn't necessarily prove that Shibai ever went to Earth, because one, the cyborgs were made in the Kara dimension, which doesn't exist on Earth. It's an entire dimension away. And two, Ishiki has the ability to use space-time ninjutsu, which means that Ishiki can freely jump between dimensions or within his own dimension. And since Ishiki is the person who brought Shibai's body to Amado, it's a possibility that Ishiki just found Shibai's body elsewhere and brought it to Amado in either the Kara dimension or Earth. And therefore, just because people bearing Shibai's Shinjutsu ended up on Earth doesn't necessarily mean that Shibai died on Earth. Well, not died, but shed his physical body on Earth. But it's important to note that all of these symbols of the Otsutsuki who have been to Earth are actually in the Kara dimension, which once again is not Earth, and therefore it's a possibility that technically Shibai shed his physical body in the Kara dimension. But if we do assume that these symbols pertain to Shibai and his lost pair, it leaves us with one of the most hotly debated questions in all of the Boruto fandom: who is the lost pair? See, some believe the lost pair is Amado, as he seems to know way too much about how the Otsutsuki work, going so far as to be able to derive Shinjutsu from Shibai's body and reverse engineer karma markings for Kawaki. And while technically all of this could have been taught to him by Jigen/Ishiki, he's also very sneaky about his own backstory and doesn't really ever tell us where he acquired all this knowledge from. And thus, it's not the craziest thing to assume that he's some kind of Otsutsuki in disguise. Others believe that Shibai's pair was Urashiki, as Urashiki was shown to have no pair, which is is weird amongst Otsutsukis, as Otsutsukis always have pairs that consist of a lower ranking Otsutsuki and a higher ranking Otsutsuki, because without being in pairs, they can't consume the chakra fruits of planets, and thus because Oroshiki had no pair, he was freely traveling with Momoshiki and Kinshiki. And while technically, Oroshiki did get cut from the Boruto movie because of time constraints, he is still canonized by the movie, as an outline of him is shown during the movie, and he pops up in a couple of manga canon episodes in the Boruto adaptation of the movie, and he has an entire anime canon arc dedicated to his story. However, in this anime canon arc, Oroshiki does die, and as we know, if you die in an anime canon arc, you're dead and gone. So regardless of whether or not you think he's a canon character, he is dead. Now technically, Oroshiki, canon or not, being Shibai's pair does make a fair amount of logical sense, as it stands to reason that once Shibai ascended to his godhood, his lower-ranking Otsutsuki was just kind of left fiddling his thumbs, and thus would be open to tag along with other Otsutsuki until they were able to find another pair so that they could become the higher-ranking Otsutsuki and eat chakra fruit. But considering how little of a role Oroshiki plays in the canon, and the fact that he's now dead and gone, makes me believe that if he was the missing Otsutsuki pair of Shibai, that would be a massively disappointing letdown, and I think Kishimoto is aware of that. Now, some people go the opposite way and say the destroyed symbols don't actually symbolize Shibai and his lost pair, and that the destroyed symbols actually symbolize Oroshiki and Toneri, as both of them would either be sealed for the next 10,000 years, Toneri, or dead Oroshiki. That's also not compelling or interesting whatsoever. On top of that, Toneri didn't know that any other members of the Otsutsuki clan even existed, and that's why when Oroshiki pulls up on him and seals him in the Palace of the Dragon King, Toneri is surprised. And thus the idea that Toneri and Oroshiki, who just met for the first time on the moon when Oroshiki sealed Toneri away, would both put their sigils next to each other in the card dimension is just kind of weird. So I tend to go the line of logic that the destroyed sigils are for Shibai and his lost pair. But if his lost pair isn't Amado, Oroshiki, or Toneri, who is it? Well, this theory that I subscribe to answers that question by looking at the source material. And I'm not talking the manga. See, almost every single one of the Otsutsuki are based off a Japanese folk hero. Momoshiki is based off a character known as Momotaro, which directly translates to Peach Boy. Momo is peach, Taro means eldest son. And that name is incredibly fitting because Momotaro is a story about a child born out of a giant peach. The story basically goes that a peach is floating down a river, and a childless couple finds the peach. And as they grab this giant peach and begin to try and eat it, when they open it up, Momotaro pops out and tells them that he's been bestowed upon them as a child by the gods. And then Momotaro grows up to be their child, and an incredibly powerful child at that, who eventually goes on a journey slaying the majority of the Oni in Japan. Oni are demons in Japan. And on this journey, Momotaro befriends a dog, a pheasant, and a monkey, which is actually why Momoshiki's abilities revolve around either a pheasant, a monkey, or a dog. And the story of Kinshiki is eerily similar. So Kinshiki is based off a folk hero by the name of Kintaro, whose name directly translates to Golden Boy. Kin for gold, Taro for eldest son. And Kintaro was a child of superhuman strength, and Kintaro was raised by a mountain witch, and is famous in Japanese folktale for catching one of the most powerful Oni in all of Japan, Shuten Doji. But most importantly, to this theory at least, Oroshiki is based off an entirely different character known as Oroshima Taro. Now, Oroshima Taro comes from a much more well-known and used story in modern-day Japanese storytelling. And while the name of this story fluctuates based on who's telling it, it's mostly known as the story of the immortal fisherman, who is Oroshima Taro. See, Oroshima Taro at the beginning of the story is just a regular fisherman. However, when he's fishing on a beach one day, he sees a turtle in danger. I believe a hawk or some kind of predatory bird is trying to eat the turtle. Thus, Oroshima Taro runs over and saves the turtle from the hawk. But what Oroshima Taro doesn't know is that this is a magical turtle, specifically a magical time-traveling turtle. And that's probably starting to sound familiar. And because Oroshima saved this magical time-traveling turtle, the turtle decided to reward him by taking him to the Palace of the Dragon King, which is a magical palace that exists under the ocean, kind of like Atlantis. And in this magical Palace of the Dragon King, they have an area that has all 4 seasons simultaneously, and it's filled with descendants of the Dragon King and his servants. And for 3 days, the descendants of the Dragon King and his servants throw a massive party for Oroshima for saving the turtle. But the person who spends the most time with Oroshima is the Dragon King's daughter, Otohime. And yes, Otohime is the inspiration for Otohime from One Piece, the queen of the Ryugu Kingdom. And the Ryugu Kingdom is just a Japanglish way of saying the Dragon Palace Kingdom, as Ryugu-jo is how you say Dragon Palace Kingdom. So if you just replace the Jo, which stands for kingdom, with kingdom, you get the Ryugu Kingdom. In fact, almost the entirety of Fishman Island and that entire arc is based off this story. But enough about One Piece, we're talking about Boruto. So Oroshima spends 3 days in the Ryugu Palace until eventually he gets homesick. And thus, in order to assuage his homesickness, he asks the magical turtle to take him back to the beach, at which he saved the turtle. To which the turtle agrees. But before he goes, Otohime gives him the Tamate box. Yes, the same thing that they have at the Ryugu Palace. However, when Oroshima goes back to the beach at which he saved the magical turtle, he realizes in the course of the 3 days he spent at Ryugu Palace, 300 years passed everywhere else. Meaning that everybody who Oroshima ever knew was dead. And that Oroshima was technically 300 years older than when he had left 3 days ago. And thus, desperate and confused, Oroshima decides to open the Tamate box that Otohime had given him, to try and possibly reverse this 300-year time travel he had done. However, it's at this point that it's revealed that Otohime had actually sealed away all of the aging he had done into that box. And therefore, when he opens the Tamate box, he ages 300 years. And thus the reason that Oroshiki's ability to freeze somebody for 10,000 years is called the Palace of the Dragon King is because of this story. And the reason that Oroshiki has a fishing rod is because he's based off Oroshima, a fisherman. And thus the reason that Oroshiki's arc revolves around a magical time-traveling turtle is because of the time-traveling turtle that Oroshima saves. And even the ending of the time slip arc is a reference to how Oroshima's life ends, as Oroshiki's ability to see multiple futures and decide which one is going to be the best for him results in him existing in Jiraiya's poisonous stomach summoning for too long, and by extension aging himself rapidly within the confines of this summoning, which leads to him consuming too much of the poisonous gas. And thus time is what kills Oroshiki, just like how time is what killed Oroshima. And thus there is very much a precedent for Kishimoto using folklore stories to build out the lore of the Otsutsuki. But how does any of this prove that the missing link in Toneri's genealogy and the symbols on the wall of Kara's hideout is a female Otsutsuki that Hamura marries? Well, in Oroshiki's arc that starts with him sealing away Toneri, every aspect of Oroshima's story is touched on in Naruto except for one thing, and that one thing is Otohime. Oroshiki's arc has fishing, the Tamate box, time travel, a magical turtle, and yet the one thing it doesn't have in the tale of Oroshima the Immortal Fisherman is the most important aspect of the story: Otohime. What if her exclusion was purposeful, as showing her in Oroshiki's arc or even Toneri's arc would show Kishimoto's late game hand? See, it's a possibility that Otohime was Shibai's pair, abandoned after Shibai ascended to godhood, who possibly reincarnated on Earth or a dimension close to Earth after Shibai ate the last chakra fruit he would ever need. Because in order for Shibai to acquire his final chakra fruit, Otohime would need to be sacrificed. And thus, after being reincarnated through her karma marking in the wake of her pair's ascension, Otohime was trying to figure out what to do. And possibly while trying to figure out what to do with the future of her thousands of years of life, Kaguya Nishiki descended down to Earth, possibly after Shibai's body. As a pivotal point of divine trees that we actually just learned recently is that they soak up the chakra of all those who are living and all those who have died on a certain planet. And thus, since the majority of Kaguya's telling of why the Earth has been chosen has been retconned, what if the real reason that Kaguya Nishiki descended to Earth is because Shibai's body is there and they wanted to make a chakra fruit out of the planet that had his body? And thus, what if the reason that these symbols were destroyed is because Ishiki and Kaguya wanted claim over Earth? Therefore, they destroyed the symbols of Shibai and Otohime. And since Otohime was a lower rank and alone, she went into hiding, as Shibai herself stood no chance against Kaguya and Ishiki's combined might. She remained in hiding until both Kaguya and Ishiki were gone, at which point she revealed herself to Kaguya's much kinder spawn, Hamura and Tagoromo, who were the first of her kind that she had seen on Earth who weren't there to pillage the body of her former pair, and who, more importantly than anything, would accept her for who she was. And thus she married Hamura because Hagoromo was out and about being the Sage of Six Paths, which inevitably reintroduced more Otsutsuki blood into Hamura's children, which led to the creation and the appearance of Toneri. But then, Nick, if she's a full-blooded Otsutsuki, shouldn't she still be alive today? Yeah, technically.
Well then, Nick, where is she?
Well, it's a possibility that after Hamura's death, she decided that she was no longer needed or wanted on the moon, and thus she decided to venture out to find whatever dimension Shibai currently exists in, to act as his guardian, or simply just to be with him again. It's also the possibility that she decided to take her own life when Hamura died, deciding to ascend to the Pure Lands with him, as she as a low-ranking solo Otsutsuki could really not accomplish all that much in terms of what an Otsutsuki would want to accomplish. And it's a possibility that living side by side with Hamura made her realize the error of the Otsutsuki ways, and thus she decided to live a much more human life. But who knows? Genuinely, we're spitballing here, because when it comes down to it, Toneri shouldn't look the way that he does. And what do we say on this page? Kishimoto never does anything for nothing. And therefore, if there's not more Otsutsuki blood in Toneri's line than just Hamura, something's got to be going on. But what is that something? I don't know. I'll leave it up to you guys. Do you believe that there's a stray female Otsutsuki who made Toneri look the way that he does, or do you believe that there's some other separate explanation? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I feel like 23andMe sometimes trying to figure out these lineages, but somebody's got to do it.